Hello and welcome to a new type of episode on Ashrit's Tipping Points. This series is called StatCat because I spend a lot of time looking at stats. So I'm a bit of a stat cat myself. Anyway, I couldn't come up with a better name, so this is it. Dark and Deep will return, by the way. I just want to do this as well, so I'm taking a little bit of a step away from Dark and Deep. This first episode of StatCat is something that I've been meaning to do for a long time. It's comparing where India is today versus the United States historically, mostly from an economic perspective. Why is this important? Well, for me as an Indian, but I think no matter where you're from, the rise of India is important to you. Just as no matter where you were from, the rise of Europe was important to you. The rise of the US was important to you. And most recently, the rise of China was important to you. And all of these regions are big parts of our lives today. The EU is still extremely important for consumption and for regulation. The US is important for financial markets and for being the global military superpower. And the rise of China is still important to you because most of the things that are made in the world, they're pretty much all made in China. The world is changing and India is looking most likely next on the cards to become a global economic pole within a couple of short decades. You and I can make good decisions, good financial decisions, decisions of where to live, where to work, what to learn, based on this. And in seeing India's rise, I want a benchmark. What better benchmark than that other large democracy that rose in the 1900s, the United States of America? India is and has been the fastest growing world economy on an annual basis for about 15 years now. A trend that I would think will continue for the next 15, if not the next 30 years. Most economists would agree with me, but of course no one can predict the future. Even at a modest 5% growth rate, which is less than India has averaged over the last 15 years, India by 2050 would have a GDP of about $20 trillion or more, which would make its economy comparable to that of the EU, China, or the United States. The world that we're heading to would be one with likely 4 economic poles. There are some big ifs and buts there, but that's the trend thus far. So here's a series of short episodes, each of which will break down one statistical area comparing India today with when the US was at that point in history, and what we might be able to project of India going forward based on that. Here we go! If you had seen the trend of the USA's rise in the 1900s, you could have made good decisions. You could have bought property there, or invested in its stock market, or even started a business to accommodate this rising power. You could have become an expert in a field relevant to that country's economy, leading to more job opportunity. For example, you could have become a great film director and catered to Hollywood like Christopher Nolan or Guillermo del Toro. If you had seen the trend of China's rise in the 1990s or early 2000s, you could have gotten very rich too, and many people did. Especially American and European investors, and let's not forget Chinese people. You could have become a foreign expert working or teaching in China, been treated very well and learned a ton. You could have learned Chinese and gone for a management role in a Chinese company as one of those bridges between the West and China. Chinese purchasing power in the world is so high today that whole countries organize their policies to accommodate China, thanks to the sheer volume of money coming in. 27% of tourist arrivals in Thailand were Chinese in 2017. More than a quarter of people going to spend money in their country are Chinese. More recently, the number of Indian tourists in Thailand is going up as well, with all the pros and cons that entails for the local customs and culture of Thailand. Nearly 10% of tourists in Thailand are now Indian, and I imagine that going up in the decades to come. The story will be the same for all countries around the world. So Thai people who made Chinese menus or hotels 10 years ago were very smart, and those who are accommodating Indians today are also very smart. Funny story, on social media and YouTube I actually see a lot of international hate towards Indian tourists in the comments. And I think this is to be expected. When you have tens and soon hundreds of millions of people with very peculiar customs and, let's face it, often bad manners, I can say this as an Indian, flocking to countries that haven't had those kinds of encounters before, there's going to be friction. Expect friction to increase. But that's besides the point. What I'm getting at is that you don't have to be Indian to benefit from India's rise. And no matter where you are going to see and feel more of India and Indians in the coming decade. And of course, if you're Indian, shut up and strap in because you definitely need to know where the country is going. So in each of these episodes of StatCat, at least this first season where I compare India with the US historically, I'm going to take one aspect of life, of economics, and compare the two. With this episode, episode 1, I want to start with the easy, low-hanging fruit, GDP and wealth. In my opinion, one of the most indicative numbers in absolute terms of a nation's economic heft is GDP. India's GDP today is about $4 trillion US dollars. The US today is about 29 trillion, almost an order of magnitude larger than India in absolute terms. And you can feel it in the world every time you see a McDonald's but there isn't a Haldiram's next to it. But what we're trying to do here is see, compared to the USA's journey historically, where India is today. So I'm going to time travel back in the USA's history to find when its GDP was the same as India's today. That was me time traveling. I'm back. The USA was last at India's $4 trillion GDP in 1945. 80 years ago. Of course, in that year the number looked like $220 billion off the time, but I'm looking at this on an inflation-adjusted basis, as is needed for such a historical comparison. So just imagine the USA coming out of World War II. The Ford Super Deluxe was on the roads, the GIs were coming back from the Pacific and Europe, and the USA had just secured its uber-dominant position as master of the universe in that year. Fun fact, the USA in 1945 had 50% of global GDP. Half of all the value being made anywhere in the world was American in that year. But GDP in absolute terms isn't everything. India has today way more people than the USA, and even still more than the USA had in 1945. So even though the US was in absolute terms comparable with India in 1945, per person the US was much better off. India today has a per person median income of roughly $2,600 US dollars on a nominal basis. That means we assume the rupee lives in the international marketplace, which it does. When we look at the USA on a per person basis to see when the USA was at where India is now, the result might shock you. It shocked me. You have to go back to the year 1724, before the USA was even independent. India's more than 200 years behind the USA in terms of income development, on an international basis. In some ways, you can feel it. You travel to rural India or even poorer parts of Indian cities, and the purchasing power is pretty much non existent. In fact, sometimes when I go to the countryside, it is literally like time traveling to medieval times. Except for the telltale signs of modernity, like plastic rubbish and trucks that deliver goods. Everything is done by hand. There are often no household appliances, like washing machines or fridges, and the economy there is entirely agricultural. In these ways, it is somewhat believable that India today is akin to England or the USA in the 1700s. You feel it internationally too. Rupees don't do diddly squat in foreign countries. Indians who are used to spending and eating out every day in India go to the US and live like the poorest 25%, including me. We don't tip because even the tip amount would buy our whole families a nice meal in India. Spending rupees in foreign countries feels like daylight robbery. And this is for Indians who are middle income or high income, mind you. For the median Indian, who's earning $2,600 a year, that's about $200 a month. If they were to somehow teleport to the United States or some other developed country, they would have pretty much zero purchasing power. Now I know what you're thinking. This comparison of India compared to the US in 1724 is ridiculous. Indian income today has to be way more than the US in the 1700s. All of humanity was dirt poor back then. They had no sanitation, they shat in buckets. But you'd be right. The progress of technology makes it really hard to do these kinds of comparisons. To add, some things don't live internationally. They live at local purchasing power. A kilo of tomatoes in India costs only 50 cents, while in the US they cost $5, which is 10 times the difference. So even though Indians today make only $2,600 per year, a US dollar goes a lot further in India than it does in America. For this reason, we have to switch over to the purchasing power parity. This adjusted income figure, accounting for price differences, is also known as PPP. India's PPP income per capita is about $12,000 a year. In 1945, the USA, with its same absolute GDP to India, had a per person income of $20,000 per year, adjusted for inflation, of course. Already double where India is today on a purchasing power basis, and an order of magnitude more on a nominal basis. Now again, this isn't a perfect comparison. Obviously, technology is vastly different today than it was back then. But if we look at purchasing power parity, the US was last at about $12,000 in 1910. So I live in Berlin, where a haircut costs 15 euros. The cheapest haircut costs 15 euros. That's about $20. So naturally, my goal for the year is how can I skimp on as many haircuts as possible while I'm in Berlin, and then when I go to India, I get haircuts every 2 weeks. Every time I have a trip to India lined up because I visit family, my goal is how many services can I not do here in Berlin so that I can go to India and get those services for like 1/10 of the price. Such that in the amount that I saved on those services, it pays for my flight ticket to India. I don't think I quite get there because my flight ticket to India round trip is like 1,000 euros. But between like 4 haircuts, eating loads of meals out, which I don't do that often in Berlin, massages, you name it, all kinds of services, I think I get fairly close. I probably get to the 400 or 500 euro mark, which is like half of my flight ticket cost. So there you go, folks. Get your haircuts in India. Fun fact, when I'm in India, I pay 150 rupees for my haircuts. That's about $2, and I tip 100%. So I pay about $4. The barber's super happy. I'm super happy. Yeah, purchasing power parity, folks. Let's go. All right, moving on. On a local basis of food, rent, services, etc., the median Indian today has about as much purchasing power as an American in 1910. That's 115 years ago. Just for fun, at some point look up recolored videos of New York in 1910 on YouTube and see how uncanny this comparison seems. There's horses walking on the roads, all the men are wearing the same suits with the exact same hats, all the women have these dresses and big hilarious looking hats too. There are the first signs of big buildings and electric street lighting. The New York subway just opened a few years before, in 1904, which checks out because Bombay or Bangalore's metro just opened about 10 years ago as well. Okay, so we have a pretty good idea that on a purely income basis, India is roughly a century, maybe a bit more than a century behind the United States of America. So I'll continue with 1910 as the benchmark year. So what about growth? How fast are we catching up? Are we closing the distance, and will it be only 10 years before we catch up? Of course not. India has one advantage in that it can use all the technologies of the world, whereas the US had to wait for those technologies or invent them. But the US had first mover advantage, patenting many of the 20th century's technologies and becoming the world leader in many high-tech fields. Think aviation, internet technology, etc. It's difficult to catch up to the cutting edge because your comparative advantage is in low-end stuff, and you get stuck there. This is called the middle income trap. See Egypt, South Africa, Turkey, and potentially China and India as well. One of the reasons China is speccing so hard into semiconductors and other high-tech fields is because they do not want to get stuck in the middle income trap. So back to growth. India today has a real GDP growth rate of about 6% and has averaged about 7% over the last 25 years. The United States in the decade of the 1910s had a real GDP growth rate of about 3%. So presumably, yes, India is closing the gap at about double the speed the US went, meaning that every year India gets about 2 years closer to where the US is today. If the US doesn't grow at all from here on out, in 60 years we might have an India with an equivalent income adjusted for purchasing power parity, that's an important part, as the United States today. Now, of course, the US will grow, and it's likely going to take the whole 115 years, and maybe even more, in my opinion, for India to catch up, but who's to say how things will go? But I'm optimistic. Things are looking up for India and for the 1.5 billion Indians all over the world. Lastly, for this episode, I want to look at wealth. This is calculated by adding up all the assets in a country at current market value and subtracting the liabilities. What we see here is that the United States is worth about $150 trillion, give or take. It makes sense. Just the top 10 companies in the United States are worth $20 trillion between them, which coincidentally is roughly equivalent to the total wealth of all of India, which stands at about $20 trillion, give or take. So here we see that in absolute terms, the United States is roughly an order of magnitude more wealthy than India. The median American is worth about $120,000. That is a lot for a country of 300 million people, but that's what it takes to be a global superpower. And the median wealth per Indian is about $4,000, so 30 times less than the USA. I will add the caveat that this stat is less clear-cut than the other ones, as you can find wildly different numbers depending on which source for wealth is used. Some of the sources of wealth calculations add up things like human capital, so how much education someone received, natural resources per person, that kind of thing. But this stat doesn't use that. If we go from these numbers, then the median Indian today is about as wealthy as an American in 1900. About 125 years ago. Again, not a perfect comparison. Technology is much better today than it was in 1910 or 1900. Healthcare, washing machines, fridges, electricity, power consumption. Hell, if we look at smartphone penetration, then India today is at about 60%, which the US was at in 2014. Nice one, team, we're nearly caught up. Jokes aside, I'm trying to illustrate that these things are tricky. And I'll sink my teeth further into these various aspects, like household appliances, infrastructure, etc., in the next episode of StatCats. Alright, thanks for tuning in. Bye.